Hello. First of all, thank you very much if you've joined the Substack or the Discord server that I set up. If you're just here for the videos, this video is going to be about the moral implications of physicalist theories of consciousness, and this is jumping off the back of a couple of other videos I've done about Michael Graziano's attention schema theory, which I think is a very good physicalist account of consciousness. And when I say physicalist account of consciousness, I mean a scientific account of consciousness that places it completely within the domain of physics and biology and stuff as we understand that now. So it doesn't posit that there's an extra realm where consciousness exists. It doesn't posit an entire extra aspect of physics that we haven't discovered yet. It just says that consciousness is completely explainable by the computations that the neurons in our brains are doing. And in response to those videos, I had a couple of comments about how Graziano's theory in particular has some very sinister implications for morality. I don't mean any disrespect at all to those commenters, and it may turn out that I've missed the point of their comments by the end of this video, although I think I kind of understand what they're saying. But I think, I don't know, I mean, it seems like these comments come from a slightly misplaced idea of how science relates to morality. So the way that I think most people in the audience probably think about morality is basically that an action is immoral if it causes harm to a conscious agent, if it causes conscious suffering, in other words. So if we assume that a tomato plant isn't conscious and it can't consciously suffer, then cutting that tomato plant in half isn't immoral as far as the tomato plant's concerned, because it's morally irrelevant, it has no consciousness. Whereas if you cut a human in half, of course, that is immoral, because the human is capable of suffering consciously, and so you're causing conscious suffering by doing that. And I think perhaps the basic issue that some people have with physicalist accounts of consciousness is this idea that they posit that consciousness doesn't really exist. And so if consciousness doesn't exist, then that means that nothing is conscious, and if nothing is conscious, nothing can consciously suffer, and if nothing can consciously suffer, then nothing is immoral. You know, you can do anything to anything, and because it's not really conscious and it's not really suffering, therefore you're not doing anything wrong. I could punch a human in the face, and because their consciousness is just some illusion, it doesn't matter that I punch them in the face, I'm still morally neutral. So I think one of the major points to cover here, maybe one of the more boring ones, so you can skip ahead if you want, is, does Graziano's theory actually posit that consciousness doesn't exist? Because this is a fairly big thing in the chain of logic here. If consciousness exists, then there is morality. If consciousness doesn't exist, then there isn't morality. I don't think... Well, I think this is a semantic point, so I don't know what Graziano's own personal answer to this would be. But I don't think his theory implies that consciousness doesn't exist. It just seeks to give an account of consciousness, and perhaps it does suggest that consciousness in the way that many of us imagine doesn't exist. The specific bundle of ideas that we think of as consciousness is misplaced. Now, we're all having a conscious experience. When I say consciousness, probably 95% of you know immediately what I mean, and you're probably thinking of more or less the same thing as me. So, yes, consciousness does exist. Of course it does. Graziano's theory doesn't try to prove that we're not really having an experience. He's not trying to demonstrate that this is false, I'm not really experiencing all this. He's trying to explain what it is. He's trying to explain what causes this experience that we're having. I think a good analogy here would be talking about language, or the language center of the brain. We can quite happily use terms like language and the language center of the brain while acknowledging that these are massive simplifications. There are certainly bits of the brain that, if you damage them, can immediately stop a person being able to use language, but in reality, you know, there are the vast swathes of the brain that are somehow involved in facilitating language, and there's no hard border between the language lump of brain matter and everything else. Semantic concepts are distributed all the way across the brain, and if certain bits of the brain were damaged, you might still be able to talk or sign if you're a sign language user, but you might not be able to talk about certain things, you might not be able to find certain words or certain lexical items. And, when you get outside of the domain of the brain, it gets even fuzzier. If a person is a monolingual Spanish speaker and they start learning English, at what point do they cross the line where you can say that they speak English? If they only know 2 or 3 sentences of English and can't understand rapid English speech, well, they're using English, but nobody would say, for colloquial purposes, that they speak English. There are no hard lines here, but that doesn't mean that language is a useless concept. Likewise, I think that whatever consciousness is, it's the interaction of lots of moving parts. We perceive it to be one unitary entity, and we talk about it as if it's one unitary thing, but in reality it's just going to be a load of different processes that are interlinked that we've attached a label to. So I think explaining the sub-processes that give rise to our concept of consciousness certainly doesn't prove that consciousness isn't real, and it doesn't prove that the contents of consciousness aren't real, like conscious suffering. I think one of the most important things here is that science couldn't disprove the idea that there are morally bad things you can do, even in principle. Science couldn't disprove the idea of morality, because that's not really the kind of thing that science has much to say about. You're not going to get a scientific paper that says, we've done some research and it turns out that stealing is 72% bad, or, we've proven that stealing is actually good after all, despite what everyone thinks, because that would be a ridiculous scientific paper, because that would imply that there was some fundamental force called bad that can be measured using scientific instruments, which I think most of us would probably agree there isn't. Bad is a social construct and good is a social construct, and all science can do, as far as morality goes, is inform us of how we could be better sticking to our own moral principles which already exist. So for example, let's say someone's in a coma. Let's say they're not responsive at all, they're not replying to anything you say, they're just lying there with their eyes closed, they've been like that for 2 weeks, there's no evidence that they're going to wake up. It might be tempting to pull the plug on the person, take out their life support so that they'll die quicker because they're basically dead anyway and it's just prolonging everyone's suffering. But if you did a scientific investigation and revealed that the person's probably still thinking, that they're probably still hearing, maybe that they're, understanding and processing what people are saying, and perhaps that there is a chance they'll wake up, that scientific investigation is not going to produce the result, it would now be 92% bad to pull the plug on this person. But it is going to produce the result, this person is more conscious than we thought they were, and so that result can then be used to make a judgment that maybe we shouldn't pull the plug on them after all. So in that sense, science can inform us of how we can better stick to our own moral principles. The moral principles exist anyway. Science didn't prove them into existence. But it does tell us how we can behave in line with our own moral compasses. Another example might be, imagine a child is behaving in a very disorderly way or a very disobedient way. The temptation might be to just sort of punish them and try to force them to behave like the other children. But if it turns out, if a scientific investigation reveals that child has autism or something like that, then that will change your approach to how you deal with the situation. You might want to be taking care of what stimuli you subject the child to, try to make sure that you don't assume that they're just being bad for the sake of it. Maybe their experience of the world is just so different that they can't stand the environments that they're in. And so that informs our behavior, and it tells us how we can better stick to our moral principles without actually providing some objective right or wrong answer to the question of how you deal with the child. But that doesn't mean that Graziano's theory has nothing interesting to say about morality at all. I think that it has a lot of interesting stuff to say. I think that it forces us to examine the exact relationship between consciousness and moral value, if consciousness is just a label that we attach to a certain set of neurological processes. Now, I'm not, again, to clarify, I'm not saying that humans don't have moral value. Of course we do. That's not a scientific statement. It's it's my opinion as a being that exists within a society with a concept of moral value. So humans have moral value, in my opinion, as a prerequisite. But I suppose Graziano's theory has something to say about which other organisms might have moral value. So I think there's something of a I don't want to say an ascending scale here, because that implies that humans are better than other animals, but there's something of a scale. Some animals might have a body schema and a world schema, so they might be able to make perceptual judgments about their body and about the world outside. Some subsection of those animals will also have an attention schema, which means they're able to make perceptual judgments about their attentional state, like I'm paying attention to the water and not to the grass. But a smaller subsection of those organisms will have the ability to ask deep questions about the philosophy of their attentional system. And that's what humans do. We ask questions like, why is there this magic irreducible thing in my brain that I call consciousness? And Graziano would say that that's a misplaced question created by the attention schema, or created by trying to analyse the attention schema. But, I think there's a very good chance that most animals with an attention schema don't ask these questions about themselves. We can never know exactly what's going on in an animal's head, but I imagine that a magpie probably doesn't ask that kind of deep philosophical question about itself. A sheep probably doesn't ask that kind of question. And so, for these animals, there isn't a hard problem of consciousness. And so then you have to ask, if the hard problem of consciousness doesn't apply to these animals, if that's not something that occurs to them, then there's no magic, even perceived magic, within the brains of those animals as there is in humans. They don't have this mystical sense that something extra and magic is going on inside their minds that so many humans have. And as Graziano's theory suggests that sense is actually misplaced, that there actually isn't something magic going on inside our minds, if an animal doesn't have the feeling that there's something magic going on inside its mind, then is that animal really conscious in the way that a human is? If an animal doesn't ask deep philosophical questions about itself, and if an animal doesn't strike upon the hard problem while it's doing that introspection, then surely the attention schema is just another computational pipeline like the body schema or the world schema. Surely it's just, electricity running through neurons. So to illustrate with one of my patented bad diagrams, you have all the things that have some kind of nervous system, which might include nematode worms and very simple things that just react to stimuli. Then within that group you have things which have a world schema. Their nervous system models the outside world in some kind of organised way, dividing it into separate objects that have their own importance and spatial location and things. And then you have organisms which have a body schema. Their nervous system models their own body, so they can maybe tell what's happening to their own body, what position their limbs are in, whether they're injured. Some of these organisms will have an attention system, a system for filtering stimuli so that only a small amount of important information is processed at once. They can pay attention to things, in other words. Then you have things which have an attention schema. Their nervous system models their own attention system, so they can know things like, I am paying attention to this, I am ignoring that. Then you have things which can pay attention to the fact that they have an attention schema. Their brains can tell them things like, I am capable of awareness or consciousness, my consciousness contains this and that information. Then you have things which can really get into the grit of it and be confused by their attention schema. Their brains can ask things like, what is my awareness? What's it made of? It doesn't seem to be made of anything, it's just there. Why isn't it made of anything? Why can't I see how it's constructed? Science could never explain this. So that's 6 nested categories. The hard problem of consciousness, the big mystery of this magical substance, only occurs in the very smallest category. Because Graziano says this hard problem is just a misguided conclusion that the brain comes to, the mystery is, if you like, imaginary. That means that the mystery of consciousness only exists if an organism acknowledges it somehow, recognizes it. If the organism isn't subject to that illusion, there's no concept of consciousness in the magic, irreducible sense of the word. Within Graziano's model, none of the larger categories here have the hard problem of consciousness. They just have nervous systems that process things. So you could draw the consciousness line right in the middle here. Only things that hit upon the big mystery are conscious in the weird magic sense of the word, in as much as they think they are. This is just a semantic commentary, of course. You could draw the consciousness line anywhere you wanted. But I think that for a lot of people, when really pressed, if you ask them what it is that makes the human experience morally valuable, they'd answer that it's because we have this apparent magic within us. We're not just responding to things, we're really aware in a sense that sets us apart from a worm or an insect or ChatGPT. I would argue that this perceived magic only exists in the very innermost circle, when you examine yourself at the deepest level and hit this impenetrable wall of apparent magic. If we do use that definition, which I think is a reasonable characterization of how a lot of people think about their own consciousness, then even humans are only conscious a small percentage of the time. There's no apparent magic when I'm walking around the house. There's no apparent magic when I'm talking to my sister. There's no apparent magic as I'm writing this video. It's only when I really think about it that the hard problem pops up. All the rest of the time I'm basically just a rat with more sophisticated neural circuitry. You might argue that's not true, because when I think about consciousness, about this rich world of unexplainable experience, I can remember talking to someone earlier, walking around in my garden, and the rich unexplainable experience was happening back then as well. I would argue that no, perhaps it wasn't. Perhaps that memory, that model of what you were doing earlier, that reconstruction, is just being filtered through your brain in the normal way. And when you pay attention to it in the context of thinking about consciousness, it feels like you had the magic in you back then as well. You can't prove it, even to yourself. At the time, you were probably just processing information about how nice the flowers look or what your conversation partner was saying. If I think about a time when I was scared someone might punch me and injure me, I'm sure I wasn't pondering the hard problem then. I wasn't thinking, oh no, if he kills me, then the magic will disappear. I was just thinking, I hope he doesn't punch me. How do I avoid that? Probably the same thing a rat thinks when it's about to get bitten by another rat. Was my suffering in that moment less morally valuable because I didn't fit into the middle part of the graph right then? I certainly don't think so. I wasn't paying attention to my attention schema. I was paying attention to my model of the world and my body, my model of the guy's fist, my anxiety. So perhaps Graziano's theory compels us to ask, is moral value really tied to the irreducible magic of consciousness? Is something really not suffering just because its brain isn't organized in a particular way? Does a worm not suffer when you cut it in half just because the worm isn't able to ponder the magic of its experience? Does a plant not suffer when you cut one of its limbs, even though we now know that its body might react in an aversive way to you doing that? It's very easy to imagine that we're the important ones and we have the magic in us, and it may be easy to extend that to other animals that react kind of like a human does when you hurt them. But suffering is a physiological response to avoid harm, and lots of things react aversively when you harm them, even if they don't outwardly react like a human does. Is it possible that our idea of animal moral value is just narcissistic, built on the fact that a cow reacts in a way that makes me feel more guilty and a nematode worm doesn't? If Graziano's theory were true, would a more scientifically grounded approach to morality be to acknowledge that if an act is bad for an organism, that act is immoral, no matter how small or simple the organism might be? It's certainly an inconvenient way of thinking about things, and we might choose to just go ahead with the way that we were doing things before. But maybe, like many philosophical questions, it serves to highlight the fact that we maybe care more about whether we feel like we're harming things than whether we actually are harming them. If you check the description, I should have put a little follow-up to this on Substack. I have a Discord server for discussing this kind of thing, and a Patreon if you're feeling generous. Thank you very much to anyone who donates to that to help me have more time to make these. I hope to talk to you again soon.